On a cold and silent night, Harper walked through the deserted streets of the small coastal town after another music class at the local conservatory. The wind carried the scent of the sea mixed with the distant aroma of burning wood, a sign of warm homes as she made her way alone back to her small downtown apartment. The town, already used to the tranquility of rural life, slept early, and the few footsteps echoing on the wet cobblestones belonged only to her. As she passed the old, deactivated train station, a place that had long ceased to receive visitors, she was startled by a sharp, continuous sound that completely broke the usual calm of the night, the persistent cry of a baby. Her steps hesitated for a moment. There was no logical explanation for that sound in that place. The station, abandoned for over a decade, was avoided by almost all the townspeople, considered uninteresting or even cursed due to old local legends. But Harper didn't believe in superstitions. She simply followed the instinct that had always guided her at the most crucial moments of life. She pushed open the rusty wooden door leading to the station's old lobby with difficulty. Darkness swallowed the space, and the only sounds were the echo of her cautious steps and the crying that grew louder as she got closer. Using her phone's flashlight, she swept the room with flickering beams of light until something caught her attention. A small bundle resting on a broken wooden bench, wrapped in a blanket soaked from the recent rain. Harper approached cautiously, her heart pounding. When she finally lifted the top of the fabric, she found a light-skinned newborn, eyes tightly shut in desperation and arms flailing, as if begging for help with what little strength he had. The emotional impact of that moment left her breathless. No one was around. No clue as to who could have left the baby there. Just him, the wet blanket, and a fine drizzle beginning to drip through the broken tiles of the old station. Harper didn't hesitate. She took the baby into her arms, feeling the fragile warmth of a body far too small to withstand that damp, cold night. Even without knowing what to do, even without understanding how anyone could abandon a child in that condition, she followed her deepest impulse: to protect. She ran home, the baby pressed to her chest, trying to warm him with her own body. When she arrived, she called the police, reported the incident with as much detail as possible, and took the baby to the hospital, where he received his first medical care. The on-call doctor confirmed that the boy was dehydrated, showing signs of mild hypothermia, but had been found in time to avoid more serious consequences. They gave him a temporary name in the records: Station Baby. In the following days, Harper never left his side. She visited the hospital daily, bringing clothes, blankets, and singing soft lullabies that seemed to soothe him. The police opened an investigation, trying to identify any connection between the baby and recent maternity records, security cameras, anonymous tips, or missing persons. No leads emerged. It was as if the baby had come out of nowhere, left in the hands of fate. Meanwhile, Harper felt something inexplicable growing inside her. That unknown child was beginning to fill voids she hadn't even known existed. When, after weeks of fruitless searching, the authorities concluded it would be impossible to locate the biological parents and close the case without resolution, Harper didn't hesitate. She immediately began the legal adoption process. She went through interviews, psychological evaluations, home visits, and countless bureaucratic steps, facing each stage with determination. She worked as a music teacher in public schools and gave private lessons at night, in addition to playing at small events on weekends to supplement her income. She wasn't wealthy, but she had something many others didn't: a steadfast heart, full of love, and an immense capacity to give. That's how Mason officially entered her life. A name she chose after weeks of researching name meanings, looking for something that represented strength but also rebuilding, because that was exactly what he brought: a new foundation for her existence. Harper prepared the room with care, decorated the walls with old sheet music and simple furniture full of history. Mason grew up listening to music from the crib, surrounded by the melodies Harper composed especially for him, as if each note were an invisible thread tying the two together through a story neither of them had consciously chosen. But that had become inevitable. She never publicly told how she had found Mason. Few knew the real story, because she didn't want him to be labeled as the baby abandoned at the station. To everyone, he was simply Mason, her son, her miracle, the reason she found strength even on the hardest days. Harper bore the exhaustion of many sleepless nights, overdue bills, and silent sacrifices. But she also carried the joy of first steps, first words, and the knowing glances during school concerts. where Mason clapped before even understanding the cadence of a melody. While the town continued its peaceful routine and quickly forgot the story of the found baby, Harper and Mason built a life of simplicity, affection, and music. In the daily struggle to provide for and educate her son, she discovered within herself a resilience she never imagined she had. Harper wasn't just a mother by choice. She was a woman who, when faced with an unexpected turn of fate, chose not to look away, not to walk away. She stopped, embraced, and made the improbable the foundation of her own redemption. From the moment Mason came into her life, Harper understood that her existence would never be the same. The boy, now officially adopted, grew up under the attentive and devoted care of a woman who, despite facing financial limitations and the absence of a broad family network, never allowed those challenges to interfere with the quality of love she gave to her son. The officialization of the adoption, completed after months of a thorough process involving home visits, psychological evaluations, and document analysis, represented a kind of emotional rebirth for Harper. For the first time, she felt that she truly belonged to someone, not in a possessive sense, but in the deep and unbreakable connection between two people who chose to walk together through a bond greater than blood. Her routine changed. She woke up earlier than before, often before the sun rose, to make breakfast, pack Mason's lunchbox, and go over his schoolwork. As a music teacher in 2 public schools in the city, she split her time between classrooms and private appointments that came as a way to supplement her income. At night, she offered individual lessons to children and adults who dreamed of learning an instrument, usually in the small studio she had set up in her living room. On weekends, she played at weddings, religious events, or themed dinners in local restaurants. Every note she played on the piano or drew from the violin was more than an artistic gesture. It was a tangible way to keep her household running, to ensure Mason's education, to pay for doctor's appointments, new clothes, and, above all, to preserve the warm and safe space she had created for the two of them. The love between Harper and Mason wasn't born out of convention, but from daily devotion. He learned to recognize his mother's presence by the way she moved through the house, the way she gently blew on the surface of his soup before bringing it to his lips, the lullabies she improvised each night with new lyrics. She, in turn, read the small shifts in his mood through his eyes, the silent anxieties, and the sudden joys of a childhood rich in affection. There was never a moment when Mason felt abandoned, even if his biological origins remained a mystery. To him, Harper had always been his mother, the one who took him in, shielded him from the rain, healed his fevers, taught him his first words, and celebrated every achievement with the same excitement as someone who finds treasure. The hardships, though constant, never dimmed the serenity with which Harper led her life. They lived in a small apartment, with simple furniture and walls decorated with sheet music and Mason's drawings. There was no luxury, but there was presence. She never let him go to sleep without a kiss on the forehead, never missed a school performance, no matter how small the event. Time was tight, the bills often challenging, but she never allowed exhaustion to turn into bitterness. She fed off the energy she found in her son's eyes, and that gave her the strength to carry on, even when the obstacles seemed insurmountable. As the years went by, Mason developed an intimate relationship with music. It was as if the sounds that had filled their home since his earliest days had taken root in his soul. At 3 years old, he could already identify simple melodies. At 4, he began to play with piano keys, creating sequences that surprised even Harper, who knew the limits and possibilities of child musical development well. At 5, he performed in his first school recital, and, at the end of the piece, ran into his mother's arms, proud of having kept time and pitch. Harper cried that day, not out of sadness, but from a silent pride only someone who has built something from nothing can truly understand. In addition to her roles as a mother and educator, Harper also led small community initiatives. She organized free beginner music workshops at a local association, offering donated instruments and encouraging other single mothers to discover hidden talents in their children. She did this not out of vanity or charity, but because she understood that art was a powerful tool for transformation, and every child deserved the chance to express themselves, even if only for a few minutes on a makeshift stage in the town square. In this loving and sensitive environment, Mason learned values like empathy, dedication, and resilience from an early age. He grew up knowing his story had a difficult beginning, but he never felt diminished by it. Harper chose not to hide her son's origins, but also not to dramatize them. Over time, she introduced fragments of the truth in a calm and respectful manner so that he could understand, in his own way, the uniqueness of the path they had walked together. The boy never showed pain over not knowing his biological parents. The only reference he had for love, care, and security was Harper, and that was enough for him. Over the years, this family structure, though unconventional, became solid. Close friends, co-workers, and neighbors began to see Harper as an example of courage and generosity. Many offered to help when she needed someone to watch Mason during a performance. Others donated clothes, books, or instruments for the workshops. But above all, there was respect, a silent admiration for the woman who had turned an unexpected encounter at a train station into a life project, a constant and conscious act of love. Even in the face of material limitations, Harper never lost the lightness in her eyes. She had dreams, many of them unspoken, but didn't allow the lack of comfort to steal her daily joy. She taught Mason that happiness wasn't in the things one could buy, but in what one could build. And so, among chords, laughter, and life lessons, their lives followed their course. A course that, though calm on the surface, was deep, solid, and full of meaning. A course that would soon cross paths with the fate of someone who, unknowingly, had lost just as much as they had gained. As Harper shaped her life around Mason, finding purpose in small gestures and the quiet joys of everyday life, the city of New York pulsed on with its frenetic rhythm, indifferent to the silent stories unfolding far from the spotlight. There, in the heart of Manhattan, Nathan Reed maintained a life marked by precision, control, and absence. At 40 years old, he led one of the country's largest investment firms, with branches on 3 continents, hundreds of employees under his command, and a relentless reputation in the corporate world. The numbers in his life impressed anyone: massive wealth, private jet travel, meetings with heads of state, and dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants. But what the reports and headlines didn't show was the emptiness carefully hidden beneath the flawless exterior. Nathan didn't form bonds. He limited himself to formal relationships, occasional encounters, and professional commitments. He maintained a rigid discipline, waking before sunrise, attending an exclusive gym, dedicating 10 hours a day to the company, and in the few free hours, immersing himself in technical readings or expansion plans. His days were predictable, mathematically divided between tasks and goals. The efficiency he demonstrated in business stood in stark contrast to the silence that filled his luxurious apartment. No photographs adorned the walls. No personal items disrupted the minimalist aesthetic of his penthouse. It was as if he had deliberately erased any trace of emotional history. This posture hadn't developed by chance. 6 years earlier, he had faced a loss that shook the very foundations of his personal life. Eleanor, his girlfriend at the time, vanished during an art trip to South Carolina. A few months pregnant, she had decided to embark alone on a creative retreat, seeking inspiration for her new exhibit. Nathan, too busy with an international merger at the time, supported the decision from a distance, promising to visit her as soon as his schedule allowed. But the reunion never happened. Days later, Eleanor stopped responding to messages. The last contact came from a coastal town, and then silence took over. No body was ever found, no concrete clue, only inconclusive leads, speculation, and a void Nathan was never able to fill. In the months that followed, he hired private investigators, traveled personally to the places she had been, and visited police stations searching for answers. He faced sensationalist journalists, pressure from family members, and most of all, the silent guilt of not having been by her side in that crucial moment. When all efforts proved fruitless, he chose to isolate himself. He never mentioned Eleanor's name again. He would coldly shut down conversations whenever the subject came up. And although years had passed, he never got involved with another woman. He avoided long-term relationships, not for lack of opportunity, but because he could no longer allow himself to build emotional expectations. The wound, though well hidden, still bled in silence. In the corporate world, however, Nathan thrived. His emotional detachment made him a ruthless strategist. He made decisions with extreme objectivity, anticipated market moves with almost clinical precision, and cultivated an image of austere, reliable leadership. His presence in meetings provoked silence and respect. Employees admired him, but few got close. He was seen as someone operating on a different level, unreachable, untouchable, inaccessible. Some considered him lonely, others arrogant, but no one truly knew the ghosts he hid beneath layers of efficiency. In the rare moments he allowed himself to escape the routine, Nathan sought refuge in discreet places, where he could walk unnoticed, watch a performance without attracting curious stares, or simply observe the world around him. In those rare breaks, the man behind the executive emerged. During one of these breaks, he decided to accept an invitation to a business conference in Lake Tahoe. The event would bring together entrepreneurs from various sectors for a series of discussions on sustainability and technology. The venue, a lakeside resort, promised not only strategic encounters, but also a pause from the fast pace of the city. Unknowingly, that trip would mark the beginning of an irreversible change in his life. The invitation to the conference in Lake Tahoe hadn't come by chance. Even if disguised as professional commitments and institutional agendas, Nathan knew that certain escapes had deeper roots. It was a silent way to flee from the emotional monotony he had built around himself. Fate, curiously, was leading him back to the state where the most definitive shadow of his past still lingered: South Carolina. It was there, 6 years earlier, that everything had unraveled abruptly. Eleanor, his girlfriend at the time, was in the early stages of pregnancy when she decided to travel alone to that coastal region. A rising visual artist, she was seeking inspiration among the old houses, the seaside landscapes, and the subtle warmth of smaller towns. She had said she needed silence, color, and space to create. Nathan, consumed by a business merger about to be finalized, believed that a few days apart wouldn't hurt. He promised to visit her soon as the deal was closed. But time proved treacherous, and the promised reunion never happened. The first days went by normally. Eleanor sent brief messages, shared photos, commented on local studios, and gave short updates on her routine. Then, silence. She stopped answering calls. She didn't read messages. The local friends she had exchanged contacts with couldn't find her. When her absence extended beyond any reasonable explanation, Nathan sprang into action. He canceled meetings, postponed flights, and landed in South Carolina with a resolve fueled by fear and guilt. He searched for information at the places she was supposed to have stayed. He spoke with taxi drivers, cafe employees, even the owners of small inns. The police registered her disappearance but found no concrete leads. The last confirmed sign was a purchase made with her card at an art supply store in a nearby coastal town. After that, nothing. For weeks, Nathan drove along highways, searched trails, flew over coastal areas, and hired private investigators. He found himself face to face with despair, a feeling he had never experienced so intensely. For the first time, he realized that the control he exercised over every aspect of his life crumbled in the face of the fragility of an unexplained disappearance. Eleanor's absence became a blind spot in his story, and perhaps what tormented him the most was the fact that she had left while pregnant. Even with all the resources at his disposal, no clue ever led to her or the child. The possibility of an accident gained strength, especially after a local fisherman found a blouse similar to the one she was wearing in one of the nearby coves. But without a body, without evidence, and without witnesses, the official conclusion remained vague. The following months dragged on, filled with fruitless searches and inconclusive bureaucracy. Nathan, who had always solved everything swiftly, found himself powerless in the face of a reality he couldn't control. Slowly, he ceased the investigations. He began to avoid the subject. He buried the story beneath layers of routine and responsibility, as if ignoring the pain were the only way to survive it. The people around him respected his silence. No colleague brought it up. No relative insisted. Eleanor became a blurry memory, preserved only in faint traces. The sound of her laughter, the smell of paint in her hair, the delicacy with which she saw the world. Nathan, though he never admitted it, carried a constant sense of failure. He felt he had lost not only the woman he loved, but also the chance to become a father. The child she had carried remained a double absence, the child who might exist somewhere, and the story that never had time to begin. Even as the years passed, certain gestures betrayed him. He still occasionally reviewed reports from investigators he continued to pay discreetly, never revealing it to anyone. He stored every photo, message, and file related to Eleanor in encrypted folders. And every now and then, during sleepless nights, he would revisit her travel itinerary, trying to find a logic that escaped his understanding. South Carolina had stopped being just a place. It had become a symbol of rupture, a territory where an essential part of his life had vanished, taking with it any possibility of emotional surrender. Nathan didn't allow himself to imagine endings. He preferred to keep the past suspended, like a wound that hadn't healed but that he had learned to hide. It was in this emotional state that he arrived in Lake Tahoe. His eyes were fixed on the figures in the presentation he would give at the conference, but his heart remained trapped in the absence of something he couldn't name. Unbeknownst to him, the reunion with a forgotten part of his history was about to happen, not through memories, but through a child who would innocently run through a lobby, carrying in their features the resemblance of a past that reason had long buried, but that fate insisted on reigniting. After exhausting all available means to locate Eleanor, Nathan underwent a silent and definitive transformation. He didn't just stop searching. He stopped allowing any new bond to form. Her disappearance, coupled with the uncertainty surrounding the fate of the child she carried, created a void in his existence that no professional success could ever fill. From that moment on, his life was ruled by an impenetrable routine. He threw himself into work with an almost mechanical intensity, accepting non-stop commitments, back-to-back meetings, and long trips that distanced him from emotional intimacy with anyone. He built a quiet, polite, but impenetrable shield around himself. His public image remained intact, that of a focused, strategic, and rational businessman. But behind the firm posture was a man who refused to relive any expectation involving emotional connection. The house he lived in, spacious and modern, reflected that isolation. Every object seemed to be in the right place, but there was no trace of spontaneity. The paintings on the walls were chosen to match the decor, not his personality. The furniture was functional, and the rooms were silent. The absence of real life, of voices or daily movement, turned the space into an extension of his solitude. He didn't host visitors, except for rare professional reasons. He declined social invitations unless absolutely required. Even in corporate settings, he maintained a reserved demeanor, participating efficiently, but avoiding bonds that extended beyond what was necessary. His schedule was controlled with surgical precision, his days filled to the brim, as if keeping busy could erase the emotional void he never dared to name. The few attempts at emotional connection over the years were cut short before they could deepen. Any sign of intimacy made him uncomfortable. At the slightest hint of emotional involvement, he would withdraw, politely, but definitively. He never explained why, never offered excuses. He simply walked away. Some close to him chalked it up to a reserved personality, while others suspected a hidden trauma. But no one truly knew what he had endured, nor what he had lost. Nathan never spoke of Eleanor to anyone but the investigators he had once hired. He kept the weight of her disappearance to himself, as if admitting what he had experienced would mean reliving the pain with a clarity he could no longer bear. Despite all the apparent coldness, there were involuntary gestures that revealed his fragility. On certain nights, even after exhausting days of non-stop obligations, he would discreetly access the latest reports on missing persons, always harboring the irrational hope of finding a trace of Eleanor, or some mention of a child that matched the age his son would be. He never found anything. Still, he never deleted the files. He kept everything stored in encrypted folders, updated periodically, a silent attempt to keep alive the possibility of a reunion he no longer knew whether he wanted or feared. The anguish of not knowing the real outcome haunted him, even when he pretended to have moved on. This choice for emotional isolation wasn't limited to romantic relationships. Nathan also avoided deepening family ties. The few relatives he stayed in touch with sensed his distance and respected his space. At family gatherings, he showed up punctually, greeted everyone politely, and left before intimacy had the chance to grow. With friends, his relationships were superficial. He never spoke about his personal life or mentioned the past. He had built a kind of emotional cloister that protected him from suffering again, even though, paradoxically, it kept him in a constant state of suppressed pain. What defined him, discipline, logic, focus on results, was also what prevented any true healing. His financial success couldn't fill the emotional void left by a story that had ended as abruptly as it had inexplicably. Thus, year after year, Nathan kept his life within that predictable cycle. Time passed, contracts multiplied, properties increased, Reports showed continuous growth, and leadership titles placed him among the most respected names in the industry. But deep down, no achievement truly fulfilled him. The recognition, though constant, sounded like a distant noise. His motivation was no longer enthusiasm. It had become mere obligation. The absence of Eleanor and the uncertainty about the fate of his child formed an echo that resonated in the small gaps of daily life, in the moments when his eyes weren't fixed on spreadsheets and decisions. Nathan didn't live. He simply functioned. It was in this state of emotional numbness, masked by a flawless facade, that he headed to the Lake Tahoe conference. The location, surrounded by mountains and the serene blue of the lake, seemed to offer something he couldn't quite identify: the promise of a reunion with forgotten parts of himself. In that cold yet welcoming landscape, fate was preparing a new turning point. Without Nathan knowing, the chance to rebuild what he had lost was closer than it had ever been since the day Eleanor disappeared. And that possibility wouldn't come with fanfare or explanations, but through the silent presence of a child whose face carried, unknowingly, the answer that time insisted on hiding. That same conference that brought Nathan to Lake Tahoe had been scheduled to coincide with the local music festival, a traditional regional event involving the community, independent artists, and children's choirs from various parts of the state. It was a weekend of cultural celebration, with performances spread across parks, schools, auditoriums, and town squares, where families, tourists, and residents gathered to support local talent. Harper, always attentive to opportunities for Mason's growth, accepted the invitation for him to participate in the children's choir performance, representing the school from a neighboring town where she taught. The event combined two of the things she valued most: education and music. She knew that this kind of experience would strengthen Mason's sensitivity and help build his self-confidence. Despite the tight schedule, ongoing financial struggles, and a pile of responsibilities, Harper organized everything with dedication and care. She arrived early in town, helped with costume preparations, attended rehearsals, and guided the other children with the same patience she gave her own son. Mason, in turn, showed genuine enthusiasm from the very beginning. Music had always drawn him in, and Harper noticed how deeply he engaged with the melodies, the gestures, and the atmosphere before each performance. He was a charismatic, sensitive, observant, and kind child. He didn't stand out just for his strong, tuned voice, but for the way he connected with the moment, as if, even without fully understanding, he felt it was bigger than himself. Harper saw a different light in his eyes whenever he sang. It was as if something inside him lit up, something hard to name but impossible to ignore. For her, each note he sang was also a living memory of everything they had faced together, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every silently conquered challenge to ensure he had a dignified home and constant affection. And now, seeing him so fulfilled on the improvised stage in Lake Tahoe's town square, in front of an attentive audience, Harper felt a pride that transcended words. As the children's voices rose in harmony, drawing eyes and hearts, Nathan wandered through the same space casually, moving between the festival booths after a meeting that ended earlier than expected. He still wore formal clothes, slightly out of place in the light and family-friendly atmosphere of the festival. He walked slowly, absorbing the scene with the distracted eyes of someone who rarely allowed himself to see the world outside the lens of business. The music echoing in the distance caught his attention in a subtle way, as if awakening something dormant. He moved closer without a clear intention, drawn more by the gentleness of the melody than any conscious purpose. He stopped in front of the crowded audience, and among the faces on stage, fixed his gaze on a child with striking features. He didn't immediately understand what made him stare at the boy so intensely. There was something familiar, an undefined detail, a recognition that came without logic, but with force. Harper remained at the side of the stage, eyes locked on Mason, unaware of the gaze resting on him from the crowd. She was focused, emotional, like so many other mothers and guardians present, rejoicing at every note hit, every well-executed step, every spontaneous smile that appeared on the small faces on stage. She wasn't seeking recognition, nor did she think about visibility. She simply wanted her son to enjoy the moment. The town, with its sharp cold and clear sky, seemed to collaborate with the magical aura surrounding the performance. And it was under that discreet yet meaningful atmosphere that the first bond between two distinct worlds was formed, without announcement, without fuss, only through the power of chance and silent presence. The meeting, though still unspoken, had already begun. Nathan remained among the crowd, motionless for a few moments, enveloped by a sensation that suddenly unsettled him. It wasn't just the music, nor just the boy on stage who captivated him with an inexplicable magnetism. It was the female figure standing out near the group of children, watching everything with eyes that blended tenderness and vigilance. There was something in that woman's posture, in the way she carried herself, the serenity contained in her expression, and the steadiness of her gaze as she followed every movement of the choir, that made him feel an unexpected vibration. He didn't know her name, where she was from, or her connection to the event, but as he looked at her from a distance, he felt a familiar weight in his chest, as if he were in front of someone who not only sparked his interest, but touched something deep within him, a place long forgotten and silenced. Her presence was not ordinary. She exuded a calm strength, an almost invisible dignity, and Nathan couldn't look away, as if his body had been rooted to the ground by the intensity of that moment. While Harper kept her attention on Mason, beaming with the choir's performance, Nathan tried to make sense of the silent turmoil that had stirred within him. The contrast between the simplicity of that woman and the pompous emptiness he often witnessed at social gatherings and corporate events completely disarmed him. She didn't seem to be there to impress anyone, nor was she seeking approval. Her focus was solely on the boy and the experience he was having. And yet, something about her pulled at him, as if she carried answers he didn't even know he was looking for. It wasn't superficial attraction or ordinary curiosity. It was an instinctive connection, something beyond logic or desire. It was as if time, for a moment, had bowed before that silent encounter. Every gesture she made, every held breath, every gentle smile she offered to the other mothers or children off stage, everything imprinted itself in his mind with disconcerting clarity. He remained there, quiet, feeling a growing restlessness, unsure how to react to what that simple presence had stirred within him. The world around him seemed to slow down, mute sounds, erase noise. His mind, usually consumed by numbers, goals, reports, and meetings, could no longer focus on anything but the image of that woman and the boy singing. It was as if, in that moment, the past and present had collided within him in an unexpected way. A woman he had never seen, but who made him remember feelings he had buried years ago. And a boy with such gentle features, yet whose eyes carried something far too familiar. Still unaware of the depth of the bond beginning to form, Nathan continued watching the two from a distance, like someone witnessing a reunion not yet recognized, but already silently shaping the destiny of those involved. Even after the festival ended, Nathan remained immersed in a growing unease. He tried to ignore the impact that unknown woman had had on his mind, but the days that followed became fertile ground for the silent growth of that unsettling and constant feeling. The memory of Harper's reserved smile, the way she watched the boy so attentively, and most of all, the boy himself, who now insisted on inhabiting his memory with unusual clarity, left no room for other priorities. He tried to return to his usual routine, resumed the business commitments that had always filled his schedule, surrounded by decisions and constant demands, but none of it managed to drown it out completely. The boy's face, the way he walked, the way he moved so lightly, the subtle resemblance in certain features, all of it disturbed Nathan so deeply that he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more behind that seemingly chance encounter. Without fully understanding his own impulses, he began a silent search. It wasn't his intention to invade anyone's privacy, nor to cause embarrassment or raise suspicions. However, there was something in that story that didn't fit, something that felt unfinished, like a book whose final pages had been torn out. The brief interactions with Harper during the festival hadn't provided many clues. She was cordial, kind within a certain discreet boundary, but always maintained a certain distance, like someone protecting an emotional territory carefully built. Mason, in turn, was spontaneous, as children often are, but even then, something intrigued him. Nathan felt compelled to investigate, not out of obsession or suspicion, but from a quiet need to understand why that encounter had shaken him so deeply. It was as if, in the presence of Harper and Mason, A part of himself long buried had begun to resurface, without warning and without permission. With the discretion of someone who had learned to move through the world with caution and precision, Nathan reached out to old contacts, investigating public records as delicately as possible. He didn't want to draw attention or raise suspicion. He just wanted answers. He searched adoption records in the area, discreetly consulted attorneys, and even checked local hospital records based on approximate dates when the boy might have been born. The search wasn't simple or immediate, but he didn't give up. With each new piece of information, he felt closer to something he still couldn't name, but that was taking shape within him, with the strength of a truth that, sooner or later, would surface. At the same time, he kept an eye on Harper and Mason's whereabouts, respecting the boundaries of casual contact. He encountered them subtly at school events or community gatherings that didn't attract attention, maintaining the posture of a calm and distant observer. Nathan wasn't sure what he would find. He didn't know if he would confirm his suspicions, or if he was simply feeding illusions built on vague features and thin coincidences. But as he dug deeper, the anguish in his chest took on clearer form. He couldn't ignore the intuition that kept repeating silently that something in him connected to that child, not from a fleeting fantasy or misplaced paternal impulse, but from something more solid, older, and real. And no matter how hard he tried to remain rational, organizing facts, comparing data, following document trails, there was a part of him that already knew, a part that felt, with suffocating clarity, that this boy had a greater role in his story than he dared to admit. Nathan, overwhelmed by a growing unease, and now emotionally entangled with that intuition gaining strength with each new detail, decided to go further in his silent search. The superficial information he had gathered on his own wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed certainty. So he reached out to a trusted private investigator, someone who had helped him in discreet business matters in the past, and who, above all, knew how to act with discretion and caution. Without immediately revealing the personal reason behind the request, Nathan provided the data he had collected, listed the names and dates he had gathered, mentioned the town where the boy had been registered, and the curious fact that Harper wasn't the child's biological mother, but his legal guardian. He asked the investigator to cross-reference this information with old cases, hospital records, local news, and any type of public or private data that could link the child to past events. What Nathan wasn't prepared for was the coincidence that would soon emerge. The investigator returned days later with a concise yet devastating report. According to the documents found, Mason had been discovered as an infant, wrapped in a wet blanket, abandoned at a decommissioned train station on a cold and quiet night. The record indicated that a young teacher had rescued him by chance after hearing his cries and, due to the absence of any relatives, legally adopted him after months of fruitless investigations. The detail that took Nathan's breath away was the exact date of the rescue. Early November, 6 years earlier, the same time Eleanor disappeared during her art trip to South Carolina. The location where the boy was found matched the last area where her cell phone had emitted a signal. This was no longer a mere coincidence, but a direct overlap of time, place, and tragedy. It was as if the past he had worked so hard to bury was now rising before him, with solid and irrefutable evidence, forcing him to face a reality that refused to remain silent. Nathan felt internally paralyzed, overtaken by a whirlwind of emotions: surprise, pain, hope, and disbelief. The silence that followed reading that report was heavier than any business meeting he had ever faced. Every word, every date, every detail recorded by the investigator pushed him toward a conclusion he had not yet allowed himself to consider. The boy, the very one who had stirred a sense of immediate familiarity in him, not only resembled Eleanor, he could be her son, a son she had been carrying when she disappeared, a son who, for some yet unknown reason, ended up alone, abandoned at that station, and who was now alive, healthy, and being raised by a woman who had devoted herself to him with love and dedication. The impact of this revelation echoed powerfully within Nathan. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, not by the force of assumptions, but by the weight of concrete facts. The confirmation that the child appeared at the exact time and place of Eleanor's disappearance left no doubt. There was a direct connection between those two stories. Nathan, now faced with an uncomfortable and powerful truth, had to put everything around him on hold. His business became secondary. His routine lost meaning. The emptiness he had always felt, the one that had haunted him since Eleanor's departure, began to be filled with a new presence, Mason. Not as a shadow of the past, but as a living part of a story he had believed ended years ago. The only question that remained now was not whether there was a connection between them, but how to handle it, how to approach a new reality without destroying the balance Harper had built over the years, without shaking Mason's sense of safety, and above all, without acting impulsively. Everything required caution, patience, and brutal honesty with himself. Fate had placed Mason in his path not by chance, and Nathan knew that from that point forward, nothing would ever be the same again. Even shaken by the discovery, and still processing the weight of the revealed facts, Nathan knew he could no longer remain silent. Time was unforgiving, and the circumstances demanded courage. He couldn't continue circling around Mason and Harper's lives like a ghost from the past, accumulating doubts and fears, without at least bringing to light the truth he now carried within him. The uncertainty about what might happen after the revelation stayed with him for days, but the conviction that he had the right, and perhaps even the duty, to clarify the bonds that connected him to that boy spoke louder. The approach could no longer be subtle. He needed to confront Harper, even if it meant awakening insecurities, discomfort, and even hostility. There was a story intertwined there, built through pain, absence, and redemption, and the moment to face it had arrived. When he finally presented himself to her with the firmness of someone carrying irrefutable proof, Harper did not hide her shock. Nathan's words struck her stability like lightning in a clear sky. The possibility of losing Mason, of seeing her life unravel because of a past she had never been able to decipher, stirred her deepest instincts. At first, she reacted with distrust, erecting walls in her posture and in the few words she managed to articulate. Although she knew that one day the boy's past might come to light, she never imagined the revelation would come in such a way, with a determined man bringing details that matched exactly what the authorities had never been able to explain. There was pain in her expression, but also an old, silent, and desperate fear, the fear of losing the son she loved with all her soul. Even though he had acted cautiously and respected the moment's limits, Nathan found himself facing an emotional impasse. As much as he hadn't demanded anything, and as much as his demeanor wasn't threatening, his mere presence represented a possible rupture in the life Harper had built with so much effort. She had devoted years to raising that boy, endured judgment, financial hardship, sleepless nights, all to ensure he grew up surrounded by love and security. Now, faced with a truth she herself didn't fully know, her world began to shake. Nathan wasn't just any stranger. He was, in all likelihood, Mason's biological father, someone who shared a blood bond with the child she had called her son since the first cry she heard at the abandoned station. The tension between them didn't explode into shouting, but resonated in silences and glances that said more than any explanation. Harper, even in conflict, understood that the man in front of her wasn't there out of selfishness or arrogance. She sensed that Nathan was just as lost as she was, trying to make sense of a path marked by loss, discoveries, and unexpected connections. At the same time, her heart was torn between the gratitude for finally learning a part of Mason's story and the panic that this blood tie could be used to claim custody or the place she occupied in the boy's life. The emotional wounds she carried, healed over time and by maternal love, began to throb again at the possibility that everything could collapse. Nathan, for his part, respected the moment. He didn't push, didn't demand quick decisions, simply revealed the truth and allowed its weight to be absorbed. The pain of losing Eleanor still pulsed in his memories, but now it mixed with a new kind of feeling. No longer grief, but an unexpected, deep, and transformative responsibility. He didn't see Harper as an enemy, nor as an imposter. On the contrary, he felt admiration for the woman who had raised his son with dignity and affection, even without knowing his origins. The way Mason smiled, how he spoke with his choir mates, the affection with which he referred to his adoptive mother, all of it showed Nathan that Harper had not only saved him, but given him a real chance at happiness. That silent confrontation, filled with emotional and unspoken layers, marked a new stage in the lives of all three. From that point on, the truth could no longer be ignored, and both Harper and Nathan would need to find a way to deal with it. not just through the logic of documents or biology, but for Mason's sake, who remained unaware of the complexity of the events that preceded his childhood. And while the world continued to turn outside, inside them a new story began to unfold, built now on the courage to face the past and the maturity to accept that love sometimes begins in the most unlikely encounters and blooms even among the ruins of old losses. After the shock of the revelation and the confrontation that broke the silent balance between them, Harper spent the following days immersed in a whirlwind of emotions. Nathan's presence was now part of her daily life, even if in a subtle way, and this change awakened a fear in her that she couldn't contain. The story she shared with Mason, built with so much effort and dedication, seemed threatened by a past she had never fully known. She felt the weight of the possibility that everything could fall apart. Nathan, although he hadn't shown hostility or made demands, represented a blood connection, a legitimate figure in the eyes of the law, someone who could, at any moment, assert rights over the boy. This fear grew silently, fueled by memories of every sacrifice she had made since the day she held that abandoned baby in her arms, still wrapped in simple blankets, under the cutting cold of the empty station. During that period, Harper maintained her routine with Mason, but something in her demeanor changed. She began to observe him more intensely, as if trying to absorb every moment, every gesture, every word the boy said. She knew she needed to be strong, but she couldn't stop the thoughts that led her to imagine a future in which she might no longer be by her son's side. The fear of losing him accompanied her through the simplest tasks, from preparing breakfast to the nights when she put him to bed. Her mind, once focused solely on daily responsibilities, was now constantly invaded by the image of Nathan, by the figure of the man who had appeared in her life, bringing truths she never expected to know. Even though she still tried to protect herself emotionally, the connection between them was inevitable, and that made her even more vulnerable. Nathan, in turn, understood the distance and fear in Harper's eyes. He knew that, to her, his presence meant risk, not comfort. It wasn't enough just to say he didn't want to cause harm. He had to show, through actions, that his intention wasn't to break bonds but to add to them. Over the following weeks, he remained present, but careful. He didn't invade spaces, didn't make demands, nor did he seek legal means to gain any kind of advantage. His interest was human, emotional, intimate. He simply wanted to get closer to Mason, understand who he was, quietly follow his steps, absorb traits that might reflect part of himself. This wasn't a battle. It was rather a reunion with his own identity, with a piece of life that fate had once denied him, and that now stood before his eyes with a force he couldn't name. The tension between the two adults, though restrained, was palpable. There was an invisible line between them, made of untold stories, old fears, emotional scars that time had not yet healed. Harper avoided long conversations with Nathan, not out of disdain, but for self-preservation. She feared that any new information would weaken her further. Still, in small gestures, he showed respect and patience. When he quietly accompanied her to choir rehearsals, he stayed in the background. When he ran into her at the local market, he limited himself to a reserved greeting. But even in those brief moments, there was a silent exchange of feelings, a mutual understanding that this story didn't involve just the two of them, but above all, a child they both loved in different yet equally intense ways. One day, Harper ran into him by chance after a school performance. The meeting was inevitable. Exhausted and with her heart heavy, she couldn't hold back the tears that surfaced. There, in front of the man who could turn her world upside down, she revealed her greatest fear, losing Mason. With a trembling voice and tense body, she let show everything she had tried to hide behind the strength she had always cultivated. Nathan, seeing the pain on Harper's face, understood that this was the moment to be absolutely clear. With calm firmness, he made it clear that he had never intended to take Mason away from her. He wasn't seeking custody, didn't want courts, and wasn't trying to replace anyone. His desire was something else entirely: to be present, to build a bond with the son that fate had now placed in his life, not as an obligation, but as an unexpected gift. He wanted to walk beside them, without destroying what already existed, but adding to it with respect and affection. Those words weren't just spoken into the air, they were followed by concrete actions. Nathan began to quietly attend public moments in Mason's life, never crossing the boundaries Harper had set. When she saw the boy smile after receiving a shy compliment from him after a performance, her heart began to waver between fear and hope. For the first time, she felt there might be room for something new to grow, something that didn't need to erase her story, but rather expand it. Although she didn't want to admit it right away, she began to see in Nathan not just a threat, but a man broken by the past, rebuilt through late-found fatherhood, willing to walk with them instead of against them. This shift in perception didn't happen overnight, but emerged like the soft light of morning slowly invading the darkness of a room. As the days passed, Mason remained unaware of the complexity of the events, living his childhood with the ease typical of those who do not yet understand the weight of adult truths. Harper and Nathan, on the other hand, had to learn to coexist, facing painful memories and difficult choices, but always guided by the same purpose, the well-being of a child who, unknowingly, had united them forever. The coexistence was still fragile, surrounded by care, but it was also the beginning of something that, with time, could grow into trust. The past had left marks on both of them, but the present now offered the chance to build something new, not a fresh start, but a continuation that honored every step already taken and embraced the ones still to come. As the days went by, Nathan's constant presence became almost natural in Harper and Mason's routine. Without haste or imposition, he remained firm in his commitment to simply be nearby, watching from a distance, respecting every boundary, and patiently waiting for the small gestures of openness that emerged, almost imperceptibly, in daily moments. At first, there were brief exchanges, timid smiles, discreet presences at simple occasions like a school performance or a visit to the neighborhood library. Nathan wasn't seeking the spotlight, nor did he wish to replace any already occupied space. His only desire was to exist beside his son, and as the days progressed, he discovered that this simple act of presence had the power to change deep parts of himself. Something in him began to soften. The rigidity he had carried for years as a shield against the world gave way to a gentleness he had long forgotten. This change wasn't brought about by epiphanies or dramatic moments. The transformation came quietly, sprouting in the smallest details. It was in the way Mason walked beside him, growing more comfortable with the presence of the man who, not long ago, had been just a distant acquaintance. It was in the way Harper, still somewhat cautious, began to share subtle responsibilities, like inviting him to a year-end performance, or asking for help carrying the choir boxes. Each of these moments revealed to Nathan forgotten layers of his own essence. He, who had lived so long guided by grief and a sense of loss, began to experience a feeling he had thought extinct: lightness. This lightness showed itself in the simplest gestures. Watching Mason smile as he built a model of the school, Nathan realized he didn't feel guilty for being there. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to enjoy the moment without the weight of painful memories. He noticed his shoulders were less tense, his breathing calmer. He realized his steps no longer carried the fatigue of a soul marked only by the past. With Mason, he discovered the present. With Harper, even in the midst of still open wounds, he found a space for possible coexistence, a place where love, gratitude, and quiet healing could coexist. And this discovery, however subtle, was transformative. Over time, Nathan found himself laughing at childish jokes he would have once ignored, becoming interested in cartoons, listening to songs he'd never have chosen on his own. His gaze, once always distant, now remained focused on Mason's small victories: a good grade at school, a new friend made at the park, a new song learned in the choir. He found himself present, truly present, without effort, simply out of the desire to be. And in that presence, he felt alive in a new way, as if something long dormant inside him had finally awakened. The memories of Eleanor still lived in his heart, but now they shared space with new memories, lighter, gentler ones. The pain of loss didn't disappear, but it became wrapped in a sense of rebuilding that gave new meaning to his days. Harper, in turn, observed this transformation closely. Without interference, she allowed time to reveal whether this man, marked by so much absence, could truly become part of that new family structure. Little by little, she herself began to see in Nathan not just Mason's biological father, but a man capable of caring, of feeling, of learning. The initial mistrust gave way to a kind of mutual respect. There were no promises between them, No explicit pacts, but rather a coexistence that, in itself, began to build a new story. Harper remained the mother Mason knew and loved, but now, at her side, there was someone willing to love the boy just as much, even if in a different way, with different baggage, on a different timeline. Nathan also rediscovered himself in this process. He realized the guilt he carried for not finding Eleanor sooner, for not being able to prevent the tragedy that separated them, was slowly softening. Not erased, not ignored, just diluted in new experiences. Each afternoon spent with Mason, each brief conversation with Harper, each small, everyday victory helped him see that life was still possible, that love didn't disappear with loss, but could transform, be reborn, take new shapes. And in that rediscovery, he found strength to face the future with different eyes. It was no longer just the past guiding him, but a new meaning that the present offered, and that was enough to keep going. Their coexistence, in the end, revealed itself not as an obligation, but as a choice. Nathan realized he could be Mason's father within the bounds that time and life allowed. It wasn't necessary to erase what Harper had built, nor to claim spaces that weren't his. It was enough just to be there, being who he was, letting the boy decide over time how he would refer to him, how he would recognize him. And it was this way, through ordinary afternoons and shared silences, that Nathan discovered something he hadn't felt in years: peace. A peace built not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of meaning. A peace born from being with his son, from a respectful relationship with Harper, and from the lightness that can only be found when one accepts what life offers, even if late, even if unexpected, even if scarred. The coexistence between Nathan, Harper, and Mason followed a cautious rhythm, as if everyone involved were learning to walk on new ground, still fragile, but full of promise. After days marked by fear and silence, Nathan's constant presence no longer stirred the same tension in Harper. Something inside her, which had been numb for so long, began to respond slowly to being around that man who, despite carrying a painful past, showed strength in his pursuit of rebuilding. The rigid figure she thought she had known at first gradually melted away under the attentive eyes he cast toward his son, through restrained but sincere gestures that expressed genuine care. Nathan was no longer just the reserved and disciplined businessman who had shown up at her door like a storm of truths. He was now revealing himself through intimate, almost imperceptible fragments that Harper could no longer ignore. In the weeks that followed, what began as an attempt at civil coexistence became something more complex, more emotional, more subtle. Harper began to notice details that hadn't caught her attention before: the way Nathan fixed his hair before leaving, the gentle way he approached Mason so as not to invade his space, the comfortable silence that would settle between them when they shared the same room. There was no more resistance to accepting his presence, but something new was surfacing, something she couldn't yet name. It was a quiet sense of closeness, of understanding, of recognition. Harper, who had spent so many years shut inside her own world, raising Mason and protecting herself from any external threat, now found herself face to face with a man who, without grand gestures or declarations, was beginning to break down the walls she had built herself. The change didn't come like a storm. It came like a constant breeze that, little by little, refreshed her soul. Harper found herself smiling at moments that used to feel neutral, laughing at brief comments made by Nathan, allowing his voice to echo in her mind even after a conversation ended. There was no longer space to see him only as Mason's father or as the unexpected visitor in her story. He was now someone who was part of her days, who influenced her mood, who awakened in her a new kind of attention. By spending time with him, she discovered nuances in herself that she believed had been dormant. She felt alive in a different way, and that vitality came not from impulsive passion, but from the subtle recognition that here was a soul who, like hers, carried scars and still sought to begin again. The reluctance that marked their early encounters gradually faded, replaced by growing curiosity. Harper wanted to know him beyond what she already knew, not through past details, but by the actions she observed in the present. She realized Nathan was more than his public image. Behind the formal demeanor, there was a contained vulnerability, a silent pain that didn't ask for pity, but offered depth. He didn't try to impress her, didn't cast himself as a hero or a victim. He simply showed himself as real, imperfect, and perhaps because of that, too human to ignore. And that recognition of his humanity was, for Harper, the most powerful trigger. Accustomed to judging men by the image they projected, she now found herself captivated by the absence of masks, by the simplicity with which he accepted his own limitations. With time, Harper began creating small moments that, even without explicit intention, brought them closer. She invited Nathan to stay a little longer after choir rehearsals, offered him coffee when he came by to pick up Mason, made everyday comments in a more personal tone. These gestures, still timid, marked a significant shift in how she perceived him. The bond forming between them wasn't built on the absence of conflict, but on their ability to listen to each other despite differences. Harper felt that with Nathan, she could be who she truly was, without having to hide her fears or mask her vulnerabilities. And that feeling, rare in her life, brought an emotional safety she hadn't expected to find after all she'd been through. The attraction that emerged was silent, almost invisible, but deeply real. It wasn't a sudden desire or overwhelming passion. It was something more intimate, more delicate, as if their souls had recognized each other before their bodies ever touched. Harper, even without consciously admitting it to herself, no longer felt indifferent to Nathan's presence. The way he spoke, the way he cared for Mason, the respect he showed her, all of it combined stirred feelings she hadn't felt in a long time. The initial resistance gave way to a softer, more welcoming emotion that grew quietly. It was as if, amidst the reconstruction of past truths, the possibility of something entirely new was being born, unexpected, yet strangely natural. Gradually, their relationship gained new layers. Harper no longer avoided eye contact as much. She allowed herself to touch his arm during conversation, or linger a bit longer when saying goodbye. Nathan, in turn, responded with the same subtlety, a longer glance, a smile that held more than politeness, a simple gesture of care. They didn't need to say what they were feeling. It was enough just to be there. And in that shared presence, both began to recognize the signs that something, still unnamed, was beginning to bloom. It was as if life, after so many losses and missed connections, had decided to reward them with a chance. Not an easy chance, nor a guaranteed one, but a real one, born from pain, from shared time, and from the mutual respect they had built for one another. Harper finally could no longer deny what was happening inside her. She felt touched by a force that wasn't destructive, but constructive, a kind of love that didn't demand promises, but offered presence. Something that didn't erase the past, but showed that it was still possible to look forward without fear. By allowing herself to love the man behind the businessman, she also allowed herself to rediscover parts of herself that had been asleep. And in that quiet, transformative process, she discovered that even after so many losses, there was still room for new beginnings. Not impulsive ones, not idealized ones, but those that grow slowly, with strong roots, sustained by something rare and essential: truth. Over time, the relationship between Nathan and Harper found its own rhythm, calm and full of nuances that only daily life can reveal. What had once been marked by tension and heavy silences was now becoming a quiet sense of closeness, built on small but deeply meaningful gestures. It was no longer about mutual tolerance, but a genuine building of bonds, not only between them, but also with Mason, who absorbed that new atmosphere with the naturalness of someone who simply wants to be loved and understood. Their routine began to include moments that, at first glance, might have seemed ordinary, but carried a significant emotional weight. By sharing those moments, the three of them began forming a kind of invisible network of affection and care, where the past, though still present, no longer overshadowed the present like a constant shadow. Spontaneous invitations for simple activities began to appear. An ordinary afternoon at the beach would turn into an impromptu picnic, with towels spread out on the sand and laughter shared between sips of juice and bites of fruit. During those times, it felt as though time slowed down. Nathan, once immersed in strict schedules and inflexible commitments, learned to be fully present, without distractions, absorbing each moment completely. Harper watched it all with a mixture of surprise and serenity, like someone witnessing something delicate take shape right before her eyes. Something that couldn't be rushed, but that grew stronger with every small gesture. Seeing Nathan lying in the sand next to Mason, drawing shapes in the sky with his fingers, was a scene Harper would never have imagined in the past. And yet, there it was, unfolding before her with the lightness of something genuine. School concerts became a ritual that brought the three of them together with a shared purpose. Mason, dressed in outfits he had helped pick out, would step onto the stage with eyes always scanning the audience for familiar faces. When he found them, fixed on him and smiling, something inside him settled. And for Harper, that was the kind of emotional security that mattered more than any explanation. Nathan's presence was no longer just a support. It was now a fundamental part of the emotional foundation she had tried to build alone for so many years. In the midst of clapping, applause, and proud photos, they weren't just celebrating a performance, but the silent journey that had brought them there. And even though none of them spoke about it openly, they all knew, somewhere deep inside, that they were living a kind of healing, a delicate reconstruction of what life had once fractured. Birthdays, in turn, took on an even deeper meaning. With Nathan's presence, the celebrations now carried a feeling of completeness. It wasn't just about the candles being blown out or the presents eagerly unwrapped. It was about what couldn't be wrapped in colorful paper, the genuine affection in their eyes, the unhurried hugs, the care in the details, like the flavor of Mason's favorite cake, or the songs that had marked the soundtrack of his childhood. Harper, who had organized these celebrations for so many years with care, now shared those preparations with Nathan, not out of obligation, but out of mutual willingness. And he, in turn, engaged naturally, as if reclaiming years that had been taken from him, not by lack of desire, but by circumstances that had kept them apart. Each birthday now celebrated not only Mason's growth, but also the maturation of this new family that, though formed by unlikely paths, was becoming more solid with every passing day. These simple moments began to accumulate like overlapping layers of memories. There was no rush to define what they were building, but there was a quiet certainty that they were indeed building something. The intimacy that was forming between Nathan and Harper didn't demand immediate definitions. It existed in the walks at dusk after a full day, in the conversations they had while washing dishes together, in the exchanged glances that required no words. There was no longer a need to justify each other's presence, no longer a need to fear the future. They were simply there, living their days, finding comfort in the shared routine, allowing time to do what only time knows how to do: heal without hurry, mature with care, reveal with honesty. And it was precisely in those ordinary days, far from major plot twists or extraordinary events, that their bond grew stronger. The solidity of what they were building didn't come from what was said, but from what was lived. The way Harper rested her head on Nathan's shoulder during a movie on the couch, the way he looked at her when seeing Mason asleep in the back seat of the car, the natural way the three of them walked side by side through the park, all of this created a new daily life, where affection manifested through small but essential actions. None of them needed to state what they were feeling. It was enough to look around and realize they were already part of each other's lives, in a way that transcended the past and gently pointed toward a possible future. The months that followed that slow approach between Nathan and Harper solidified something that had already gone beyond the bounds of cordial coexistence. With every gesture, the three of them became more connected, more intertwined by routine, by the small daily rituals, and by a sense of belonging that couldn't be explained solely by biology or recent proximity. Mason seemed to blossom in that new environment, with a lightness that had only hinted at itself before, but now became clear in his behavior, in his speech, in his drawings and looks. He laughed easily, showed curiosity about the world, and responded calmly to the common frustrations of childhood. He felt safe, loved, and heard. Harper and Nathan shared responsibilities naturally, dividing decisions and tasks without conflict, as if they had been practicing for years the art of caring together. And even though there was no rush or explicit declarations, the bond between the two adults matured with the strength of something that had been built with care and truth. It was in this context of apparent stability that completely unexpected news broke through their routine. It first came as a phone call from abroad, then as a series of documented confirmations. Eleanor was alive. She had been living for years in a small artistic community in Mexico, isolated from the world, far from any contact with her previous identity. After a car accident that left her with no serious physical injuries but impaired her memory, she was taken in by a group of nomadic artists who traveled between villages organizing workshops, outdoor exhibitions, and small performances. Over time, even without remembering who she was, Eleanor found a place there, reinventing herself with a new name, a new face, a new story. Her physical features remained almost unchanged, but her gaze carried the weight of an internal absence. She didn't know who she had been, nor where she had come from. She lived with a sense of peace disconnected from her former world, until fragments began to reemerge. A child's face, a lullaby, the image of a window framing the snow, and, little by little, her identity began to be reconstructed. Upon returning to the United States, now aware of who she was, Eleanor did not carry the urge to reclaim what had been lost. There was no bitterness in her actions, no demands in her heart. Above all, she felt haunted by the gap of so many years, by the child she had left behind, and by the man with whom she had once shared dreams and fears before the tragedy. But she also brought with her a kind of serenity that was hard to explain. She wasn't driven by urgency, but by a genuine desire to understand what had happened, and more importantly, to understand the place she might still hold, if any at all. Her reunion with reality was quiet, guided more by observation than interference, and it was in that silence that she discovered what she never could have anticipated. Life had gone on. Not just gone on, it had flourished. The boy she believed she had lost had been embraced by a strong and sensitive woman, who had given him not only a home, but also the freedom to be who he was. And beside her, Nathan had rebuilt himself with moving maturity, without letting the pain of loss turn him into someone hardened or vengeful. The first time Eleanor saw Mason, it was from a distance, through the leaves of a tree in the park. She didn't dare get closer. She just wanted to see, to feel, to observe that boy who now walked confidently alongside two adults, who smiled and exchanged glances of complicity. He was happy, that was clear. There was lightness in his posture, confidence in his gestures, freedom in his expression. He was not a boy burdened by trauma or absence. He was a boy who had been loved. Eleanor held back her tears, not out of restraint, but out of respect for that scene. In that moment, she understood there was nothing left to claim. The love she had once known, and that had been brutally interrupted, had found another way to exist. And though it broke her heart in silence, it also offered her a kind of comfort few understand, the comfort of knowing that, even in her absence, she had been replaced with dignity and love. The reunion between Eleanor and Nathan was inevitable. There were no storms, no accusations, just a dense silence, filled with memories that returned with force, with absences that now stood before them in flesh and voice. Nathan, though shaken, recognized the pain and courage of the woman he had once loved, and who now reappeared before him in a different form. There was no room for anger. The time that had separated them had also transformed them. He was no longer the same man, and she was definitely no longer the same woman. What they had lived, although still present, belonged to a time that could no longer be restored, and in that understanding, they respected each other in silence. Nathan offered her what he could, listening, presence, and a bridge, so that if she wanted, she could get to know the son they had brought into the world together. But Eleanor, with the same serenity with which she had lived the past years, declined any form of intrusion. She didn't want to enter like a gust of wind into a home where the windows were already closed and warm. She only wished to observe from afar, with love, and maintain a thread of connection that wouldn't disrupt the balance they had achieved. When Harper learned of Eleanor's existence, she reacted with the natural shock of someone who sees the past emerge from an abyss. But she didn't feel fear or jealousy. Above all, she felt deep compassion. That woman had lived a kind of emotional exile that no explanation could ease. And now, in the face of the reconstruction of everything that had been lost, she showed a dignity Harper couldn't ignore. The two met in silence. There were no words between them, but there was understanding. Eleanor, with a calm gaze, made it clear that she hadn't come to take anyone's place. She only wanted to ensure her son was well. And upon seeing with her own eyes that he was more than well, he was whole, loved, safe, she felt freed from a guilt that had never truly been hers. She left again, not as someone fleeing, but as someone letting go. She maintained occasional contact, sending sporadic letters with drawings and thoughts. She never asked for anything. She simply offered presence in the form of memory. And so, Eleanor continued living on the margins, but in peace. She moved to a small town where she resumed painting and began writing short stories inspired by fragmented memories of the life she had left behind. She received occasional updates about Mason, sent by Nathan, and always replied with affectionate and discreet words. For the boy, she became an ethereal figure, present in letters and images, but never occupying the role of mother that Harper fulfilled so solidly. She was like a distant star, not directly touching, but illuminating in her own way. And that's how the cycle closed, not with the pain of a rupture, but with the maturity of a choice. Instead of claiming a space, Eleanor recognized the value of what had been built in her absence. And in that recognition, she found the purest form of love, the conscious act of letting go for the sake of another's happiness. After Eleanor's quiet return to her new, distant life, the daily routine of Nathan, Harper, and Mason finally found a way to fully stabilize. Eleanor's presence, even if fleeting, brought closure to invisible cycles that had still hovered over that new family. Her choice to remain distant, not out of weakness, but out of love, freed everyone from old ghosts and made room for the present to take root with more truth. Nathan felt this deeply. For the first time since learning of his connection to Mason, he no longer carried the weight of the past as a burden, but as a necessary part of the journey that had led him here. He began to see that everything he had lived, the losses, the reunions, the silences, and the fears, had served to shape something more important than any biological definition. The daily choice to stay, to care, to love, even when retreat would have been easier. Harper, in turn, also began to view her own story with more lightness. She no longer saw herself as the solitary guardian of a boy who needed saving, but as a woman who had built a life with him, and now, with Nathan, a life forged with dignity, step by step. The love she and Nathan developed didn't come from impulse or empty promises, but from constancy, from listening, from the silent sharing of pain and small victories. It was a love that grew in the mornings spent making breakfast together, in the laughter at night while folding laundry, in the moments when they simply sat side by side watching Mason play, needing no words. Routine, once synonymous with fatigue and repetition, became a stage for a deep feeling that didn't need to be declared, only lived. And it was in that space of maturity and mutual surrender that both began to realize what united them was something far more solid than convention. It was the ongoing choice to be a family. One late afternoon, when summer was already beginning to show signs of farewell and the Charleston breeze brought that freshness that announces autumn, Nathan decided to do something that had been maturing within him for months. He knew well the importance of details to Harper. He knew she valued the symbolic, things that carried memories and sincere intentions. That's why he rejected any grand or cliché ideas. He chose something intimate, meaningful. During a walk by the sea, along a more secluded stretch of the coast, where the sky reflected golden tones over the calm waves and seagulls passed like white brushstrokes across the horizon, he took from his pocket a small, handcrafted wooden box. Inside rested a handmade ring, delicately carved, with a treble clef engraved on the band, a direct reference to Harper's passion for music, something she had always carried as a source of balance and identity. There were no solemn words or elaborate speeches, just a firm, serene gesture, deeply filled with truth. Harper immediately understood the meaning. Her eyes welled up not from surprise, but from confirmation. It was as if time had waited for exactly that moment, that setting, and that shared breath to seal what had already been lived for so long. She extended her hand, allowing Nathan to slip on the ring, and let herself be embraced in a hug that sealed more than just a commitment. It marked a journey. There was no party afterward, no extravagant celebrations. They walked back home side by side in silence, with Mason between them holding their hands, just like he always did. And in that silence, everything was said. The past had served its purpose, the present was fertile, and the future finally seemed possible. Months later, with autumn matured in shades of orange and brown that painted the trees and the sky with a calm palette, the ceremony took place. They chose an old pier extending over the sea, where the sound of the waves served as a natural soundtrack, and the gentle breeze accompanied each gesture delicately. There was no crowd, no imposed formalities, only the few who had truly been part of the journey, some close friends, longtime neighbors who had watched Mason grow up, and a few school children who were his childhood playmates. Harper wore a simple, flowing dress, white like sea foam, with her hair down, no adornments, just a small flower tucked behind her ear. Nathan wore a light linen suit, no tie, barefoot on the wooden pier, as a way of being fully present, connected to the moment and the place. Mason, as ring bearer, was the one who brought the rings. He wore short linen pants, suspenders, and a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves. He walked confidently, holding a small cushion where the two rings rested. There was a sparkle in his eyes that didn't come just from the excitement of the ceremony, but from the quiet understanding that something important was being sealed there. He knew, with the intuition typical of sensitive children, that the moment confirmed what he already felt every day, that his parents loved each other, that they were together by choice, and that he was a vital part of that union. As he handed over the rings, he didn't need to say anything. He just smiled and stayed close by, watching carefully, as someone who understands the value of what is unfolding before their eyes. The wedding had no speeches, only silent vows, lingering glances, and hands that clasped firmly. When Nathan placed the ring on Harper's finger and she returned the gesture, both felt they weren't just marking a new beginning. They were honoring the entire journey that had brought them there. Every loss, every reconciliation, every moment of doubt, and every small joy. The ceremony lasted just as long as the sun took to touch the horizon, painting the sky with a deep golden hue. When the last light disappeared, the guests lit small candles arranged along the pier, illuminating the start of that night with a soft, welcoming glow, as if the love experience there didn't need any excessive shine to be noticed. It only needed to be present. The celebration was just as serene as the ceremony. A long table, covered with raw linen cloths and decorated with wildflowers, gathered everyone under a simple pergola with lanterns gently swaying in the breeze. The food was homemade, prepared by neighbors and friends who were eager to contribute. There was laughter, stories shared, soft songs played by a guitarist friend of Harper's. In a corner, Mason drew in a notebook while observing the adults, as if mentally archiving that night to revisit it in the future. And in that atmosphere of communion, something was definitively solidified. That family, formed by conscious choices and affections nurtured day by day, was real, solid, and had triumphed over time. At the end of the night, while everyone said their goodbyes, Harper, Nathan, and Mason stayed a little longer on the pier. They sat together, feet dangling above the dark water, and silently gazed up at the starry sky. There was no need to say anything. There they were, three people who hadn't met by chance, but who stayed by choice. And in that shared silence, wrapped in the salty breeze and the sound of the sea, each one of them felt, deeply and definitively, that they were exactly where they were meant to be. As the seasons passed, the life of Harper, Nathan, and Mason began to flow with the serenity of those who have learned to respect time. The wedding, held under the golden light of a quiet sunset, was not an ending, but the natural continuation of a journey built on deep roots and carefully cultivated affections. They didn't try to make their lives extraordinary, only true. And it was in that unpretentious daily life that they found a quiet, solid, and silent happiness. The routine, divided among each one's responsibilities, followed a harmonious rhythm. Charleston remained their base, with its tree-lined streets, the Atlantic breeze still gently cutting through late afternoons, and the memories resting within the walls of the house where it all began. But little by little, they also made space for Aspen, where the mountains seemed to reflect with their quiet majesty the strength that united them. They split their time between these two worlds, balancing work, education, and affection, so that each place represented an extension of what they had become, a family that knew how to choose, to build, and to stay. Nathan, keeping his strategic and entrepreneurial mindset, began dividing his time between business trips and days reserved to be fully present with Harper and Mason. He never again allowed routine to emotionally distance him from those he loved. He learned to say no to meetings that crept into weekends, learned to prioritize simple dinners at home, games in the backyard, or just conversations at dusk. He no longer sought to prove anything to anyone. Success to him was no longer measured by charts or closed deals, but felt in the ease with which Mason ran to him after a trip, or in the way Harper rested her head on his shoulder while they watched any movie on the living room couch. He found a new definition of power, the kind that comes from presence and consistency. Aspen, for Nathan, represented that regained peace, a refuge where the phone stayed off for hours, and mornings began with walks among the trees, accompanied by Mason and the steady rhythm of mountain silence. Harper, in turn, blossomed in a way that sought not approval, but expression. She resumed her music lessons with greater intensity, not as an obligation, but as a mission. She felt that, through teaching, she could touch something in others that connected directly to her own essence. Many of her students were local children, often in vulnerable situations, and she saw in them the same attentive eyes Mason once had when he still carried insecurities and invisible scars. That motivated her. She didn't seek applause or public recognition. What moved her was knowing that her story, now redefined, served as a silent inspiration for other journeys. She divided her weeks between the music school she founded in Charleston and small cultural projects in Aspen, always adjusting her schedule to remain present for Nathan and Mason. In their daily life, she was the one who stitched together the small details of family life, preparing meals with care, organizing trips between their two homes, and helping Mason study or explore new interests with curiosity and discipline. Mason, growing up in this setting of balance and solid love, developed a refined sensitivity. From a young age, he showed an affinity for the arts, especially the piano. He spent hours at the instrument, not out of duty, but pure enchantment. His small fingers glided across the keys with ease, as if they were translating feelings that didn't yet have names. Harper, always by his side, guided him patiently, allowing him to discover his own rhythm. Nathan, even without musical knowledge, watched closely, recognizing in that daily act something deeply symbolic. Watching his son play was witnessing a childhood being lived with freedom and love, something he himself never fully experienced. Mason's childhood was now the ripe harvest of what they had planted with perseverance, a childhood where love was safe, guidance was strong, and memories were sweet. Inspired by their own journey and the quiet transformation they experienced as a family, Harper and Nathan decided to expand the reach of that impact. Living a comfortable and honest life wasn't enough. They wanted to give back, to create spaces where other stories could find the same chance to begin again. And so the foundation was born. Named Aurora, symbolizing the rebirth of everyone touched by their projects, the institution began working in two main areas: welcoming children in abandonment situations and supporting single mothers in vulnerable conditions. The idea was born organically. Harper knew well the burden of carrying motherhood alone. Nathan, on his part, never forgot how Harper's presence had saved Mason from emotional neglect. Together, they knew they could offer more than resources. They could offer listening, structure, and dignity. The foundation started small, with one location in Charleston and another in Aspen, but grew supported by ethical partnerships and their direct involvement. They never delegated the heart of the project. Harper taught music workshops to the children served. Nathan offered mentoring for mothers seeking to re-enter the job market. Mason, though still very young, organized school fundraisers among his peers, learning early on that privilege is honored through action. Over time, amid the blossoming of this new chapter, Eleanor reappeared in a discreet but transformed way. She was calmer, with eyes less overtaken by anguish, and an expression less burdened by absence. She didn't seek to reclaim spaces that were no longer hers, but offered what she could with honesty, a sincere desire to help. She became a volunteer at the foundation. Slowly, she began working with the newly arrived women, offering her own experience of overcoming hardship as a way to build connections and open paths. Harper, with her firm generosity, accepted this gesture without reservation. Nathan, with maturity, also recognized the value of this new presence. And Mason, who now understood the outlines of his own story more clearly, saw in Eleanor not a threat or an absence, but someone who, within her limitations, was trying to contribute to the good growing around them. Their relationship never turned into intimate closeness, but into mutual respect and a possible coexistence, where the past no longer needed to be revisited, only understood. And it was in this setting of quiet reconstructions, strengthened bonds, and expanded affection that the story reached its final image. In the main hall of the music school, the late afternoon light came in through the wide windows, painting the wooden floor with soft golden tones. The sound of the piano filled the room with delicate notes, like a wordless narrative. Mason, sitting with graceful posture at the instrument, played with focus and sensitivity. His hands, now more steady and confident, shaped melodies that seemed to evoke the entire journey that had brought them to that point. Beside him, Harper followed his performance with a quiet gaze, full of pride and tenderness. A little farther back, sitting in a modest armchair, Nathan watched with crossed arms and a reserved smile, absorbing each note as if each one confirmed everything they had chosen to build. Outside, the sky took on warm colors, and the sun slowly sank over the Atlantic. The camera slowly pulled away, gaining altitude and breadth, revealing the school, the city, and then the sea, while the music continued flowing like an invisible thread connecting everything. The last light of the day dissolved on the horizon, and there, in that serene and full moment, a new beginning was sealed, not as a promise of perfection, but as a celebration of what is built with love, choice, and presence.